How in the world can you get so high up in the totem pole of society and sink to the absolute lowest depths? That's what we think, right? There was a documentary that went out not terribly too long ago that ESPN put out, and I haven't watched it yet, but it's about how a lot of the stars that you see in football, I think it's football, a lot of them go broke or bankrupt, maybe after their careers. We think about these meteoric rises and we think, how can somebody be so high up and get so low? And I think the reason why we think that is because we feel like if we got to a high position like that, that we might handle ourselves in a little more of an effective way. Maybe we might maintain just a little bit more. Well, the story of Solomon, unfortunately, is one of those meteoric rise and fall stories. We deal with a man who had everything and sunk to the lowest depths. We all know the story of Solomon. He's David's son. He prayed for an understanding heart. He became king, and he was granted more wisdom than any other king before him. He was also granted riches and honor. But somehow suffers this huge fall in the 11th chapter of the book of 1 Kings. How it happened is listed right here. I'd like for you to look at that with me. Chapter 11 and verses 1 through 13 of 1 Kings. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord has said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is the east of Jerusalem, for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to other gods. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon, because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant, my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and I will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. How in the world did Solomon's fall happen? How in the world did Solomon's story turn from a triumph to a tragedy? I think it's a few different things. One of them is this. It's pretty clear, at least in the teachings of these 13 verses, that Solomon's commitment to God really wasn't what it should have been. And now I want you to understand what I'm saying here. I'm not talking about the relationships that he shared with all of these women. I'm talking about something separate from even that. Solomon had sort of a half-hearted commitment. Look at verse 2 with me. Notice in verse 2 it says, Solomon held fast to these in love, talking about his wives and their sort of commitment to their idolatry. Notice in verse 4 it says, "And his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been." You drop down a couple verses from that to 6. "He did not follow the Lord fully as David his father had done." So at least 3 different places what you see very present, and is not only just his commitment to pleasing other people, is that Solomon didn't really have his complete heart in the commitment of God. And which is kind of interesting, because if you go back in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 3, it says about him that Solomon loved the Lord, that he walked in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So even before he had his descent into all of these romantic relationships, he still had some personal problems with his commitment to God. Notice the high places here is referring to places of idolatry. So he did a lot of great things in his life, and I'd say there's many aspects of Solomon's life where you can say he was a really good man, but he had sort of a divided loyalty that he experienced. And even in the days of the Old Testament, what God desired or wanted from his people was total commitment. Deuteronomy 6:5 comes to mind. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might." Jesus says, even in the New Testament, God requires of it then too. Jesus says, "He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." So in every era of time, brethren, what you can see very plainly is that God has wanted a person's whole heart to be involved in that commitment. And there's got to be a reason why that is. Why does God require that? Certainly we understand that He's God and He doesn't necessarily have to have a reason. But I believe we can find the answer, and the answer, I think, is in saying this. How devoted someone is to an ideal determines how well they're really going to stick with that ideal. And I think the level of devotion that really God desires from us is to not just want to be in the right with Him or want to do what's right. I think He wants it to be a need in our lives. As if we have no other option, that this is just something that I have to do. For example, if my goal to exercise and become healthier, how devoted I am to that goal determines how well I'm going to stick with it. If I want to, I can cut as many corners that I want and just not work out. And I won't see any results from that. But if it becomes not just a want in my life, but if it becomes something that I have to do, a need, then there's no option whatsoever, at least in my mind. There's no plan B. You find a way to make it happen. And I think that's what God really desires from us. And that's what I think what was present with Solomon sometimes is present with us. Maybe we're not all in like we should be sometimes. So when temptation comes, maybe because of our devotion level, we're taken away by it. And sometimes our brethren don't come back from something like that. And I think it's because true discipleship is not there. So the commitment level is at least one factor in Solomon's tragedy. There's another factor, though, that comes into play here, and that is the company that Solomon keeps in his life. One thing we remember about the very end of Solomon's story was the number of women with which he was romantically involved. 700 wives and princesses, 300 concubines. I don't know how he worked that he have just a new one every week or what. That's what we ask ourselves from time to time, right? On top of that, these women weren't just anybody. They weren't people of his kingdom. They were foreign women bringing their own religious viewpoints with them as part of the relationship. In verse 2 says, "From the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after other gods." So God had already said, you're really not supposed to be associated with those people. And you can actually go and read the specific command. Keep in mind, we're all part of the Mosaic Law right here. And in the Mosaic Law, that's what it taught. Exodus 34, 12 through 16, and Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 4. And if you go and look at Deuteronomy 7 specifically, you notice that there was a command there not to marry any foreigner. But Solomon, well, he sort of messed that up, didn't he? The general rule was that. Now, it's very clear in the text that the people with whom he was the absolute closest in life had a really, really negative effect on him. Verse 3, his wives turned his heart away. Verse 4, when he was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods. Verse 8, thus also he did all for his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Even to the point where he's erecting these palaces of sacrifice for his wives. Proverbs 13:20 says, "He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." Imagine if all of a man's relationships, or the majority of his relationships in life, his close personal relationships, are with religiously foolish people. How else would you expect Solomon to turn out from something like that? So the company that we keep, I believe, does affect us. Although I'm not sure that you can pin every single bit of what happened to Solomon just on the romantic involvements he had, I think this probably had to be one of the biggest contributing factors to what happened to him. He surrounded himself with people who were ungodly idolaters, so he ended up turning out like them. I've noticed a common thread in many people's lives who have struggled with certain sins that have a polarizing nature about them. I'm talking about things like alcoholism, drug addiction. Many times, the company that they keep can decide their path for bettering themselves or making it worse. This week, I watched an interview with who is now a former NFL quarterback. His name is Johnny Manziel, but they used to call him Johnny Football. And he was really just sort of an enigmatic character. He's younger than I am. He's 25, I think. But in college, he was a really just a very, very high-profile player. In fact, he won the most prestigious award anyone can win in college football, and that is the Heisman Trophy. So he was this really big deal. He had kind of an arrogant attitude about himself, and so he was drafted into the NFL by the Cleveland Browns in the first round. But during his time, the most interesting thing happened. All the fame and all the fortune, and even before, I think, his time in the NFL, he had a drinking problem. And really, I guess all of the money he got just served to make that even worse. Until eventually, the Cleveland Browns cut him from the team. He was dismissed from professional football. Now, he stands today on the path to recovery, and he was interviewed the other day asking what he did to change himself. He was interviewed by NFL Network, and I thought what he had to say was really interesting. Listen to what he said. He said, I've cut off a lot of people in my life. Friends that I'll always love, but at the end of the day, they're just not good for me right now. I have an uphill battle as it is. I had to rise all the way to the top of the mountain, and then I fell really, really hard. Now I'm trying to climb out of the ashes and get back to relevancy, back to playing ball, which is what I love to do. Now there's all of that I understand, sometimes we think, well, will it really happen with him? Will he actually change? And I don't know that. I would like to think, and I would like to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he has. But the interesting thing about his path to change that he mentioned, which I think is relevant to our teaching, is this. He cut those people off in his life because he realized what a detrimental effect they had on him. He understood the influence of other people. So part of my exhortation for us this evening is to take note of the people you have in life. And I'm not saying cut those people off that you don't feel like that you could find beneficial, but do take their influence into effect in your life. Understand the kind of effect they can have on you. It's a powerful, powerful thing. Here's the third thing that I think affected Solomon. He had a compromising spirit about him. We know along the way Solomon must have made some compromises with his wives. And from what I studied from others this week, I'm not sure that it was just some overnight decision that he made. Just one day the switch flipped and he said, okay, well, I'm going to be an idolater. Especially after being such a godly man that he was. More than likely what happened was years of just small compromises here and there. Maybe just a little bit here, a little bit there, then some here. And you see what happens when you do that? It's like a snowball effect. You know that little, what you see in a cartoon? The character starts rolling down the hill and what happens? The snowball just gets bigger and bigger as it keeps on going down. Sometimes that happens in people's lives. It starts small. And it just gets progressively bigger and bigger and bigger until, before you know it, everything's out of control and you can't stop that ball rolling down the hill. There's a man named Dale Ralph Davis that had a really good illustration about this. He says, the process is like what happens with your eyeglasses that you wear on your face. We may wear our eyeglasses constantly, or at least repeatedly, and subject them to frequent cleanings. But unless we happen to be toying with them or uncharacteristically inspecting them, we likely do not notice whether the minute screws that keep the frames securely around the lenses might be getting a bit loose. One might almost thoughtlessly check and find a screw has loosened up a couple turns. It's more probably, however, that a lens simply pops out when we're in the middle of something. We were completely unaware that the frame was loose. It happened gradually, slowly, imperceptibly. Now, brethren, don't you think Satan can work that way too? Do you think any person who has fallen away from the Lord, and it just happened overnight, Satan works it in there? Just like when the frame of our glasses or the lens of our eyeglasses pop out of the frame. It happens gradually, slowly, without us even really noticing that it's happening. And it's not until we're in the hole that we're aware of it sometimes. And that's because constant compromise has done that. So if we're people who compromise our convictions here and there, consider how far that will really end up taking us. Could it possibly take us into the direction of King Solomon himself? Possibly. We can't rule it out. Remember what people say, never say never. So I want each and every one of us in our stories, when you think about Solomon, I want every one of us to have the picture of a meteoric rise. A rise from the ashes of sin to the glory in heaven and eternity with God. But along the way, we have to avoid the pitfalls, commitment issues, company we keep, the compromises we make. And if you're doing that, there's no better time than now to change that. And I will ask you to take note of this, brethren. Solomon was in old age when this happened to him. So don't think that it can't happen to us. If you're here this evening and you need the prayers of the congregation, please come. All together we stand and sing.